Thank you for inviting me. So what about impunity in the Great Lakes? This is a big job, especially regarding mass murders perpetrated for 60 years in that region, especially during the 30 years. Some of them have not been punished, and of course it would take much time to talk about it. So I will just focus upon the Rwandan issue. This genocide is, of course, so much important, especially regarding from the French political side, because the defendants and plaintiffs are always taking a step back, as Mr. Fournier said. So people believe that they have, of course, to put a judgment about that, and they fall in the trap because, especially if they say, "Okay, if you do not agree with me, it means that you're against me." So this is a trap. In this case, in this context, responsibilities are pretty much difficult to identify because of from the legitimate profile. This is a tricky issue in the field of research about responsibilities. All that this was polluted because of the denial policy at that time. Especially regarding this issue. In Rwanda, they said that there were one genocide perpetrated by the Hutu power and the same by the FPR. So this was a so-called double genocide, but of course, having said that, all this leads to confusion regarding the perpetrators between Hutus, Tutsis, torturers, and militias. And this is, of course, very confusing because in this case they deny their responsibilities. This is a very tricky exercise. Why? Because of regarding what some observers said, and they say that negationism, of course, means that they deny those murders. Now, regarding those different problems, I suppose that we have to reduce the emotional level of that discussion, and we have to take stock of the situation, to clarify the situation. And to do so, I believe, as far as I believe, we have, of course, to identify some milestones, I would say. The first milestone means that there is no right or wrong victim, if you will. We need, of course, to emphasize the remembrance. This is so much important for all the victims of the genocide, and in addition to victims of the FPR in the RPF in Rwanda and Congo. So this is, of course, this is a denial policy that has been implemented, and as Anne Guibert and Pradol said, and of course we have to be very careful about this denial policy. But having said that, since the beginning of inception of the war in Rwanda in the 90s, and because of the various wars waged in Congo from 1996, the RPF did not care about the rules of engagement or whatever. And we mustn't forget what happened. Otherwise, we would deny it because of justice that has to be, of course, emphasized. Reconciliation will be accompanied thanks to remembrance. I'm not going, of course, to tackle about the crimes conducted by Mr. Kagame, but I believe that we have to take stock of the situation regarding a second milestone that should be emphasized, which is also, of course, very much important because people are responsible for what they do. As a consequence, fighting against impunity will not lead to a competition between the victims and the murderers. regardless of the crimes that have been committed by the RPF, even if they are, of course, responsible for the assassination of President Abiyaramana in 1994, I think that Mr. Kagame's movement is not responsible for the genocide because of its strategy. So the RPF is partly responsible for that, especially regarding the tension that led to genocide. But at the end of the day, they are not responsible for the genocide. Jean-Paul Goutte said that, of course, regarding, we can compare it with the crimes committed against the Shoah. And that would not change the situation regarding what was committed in Auschwitz. And of course, we cannot interpret the past as it was. So the genocide is, of course, a state crime. That is to say, the result of an extermination campaign that was well orchestrated by the Hutu power forces, the interim government in Rwanda, part of the military forces, the propaganda, the media, etc. All those who were in favor of that fueled this genocidal approach. So having said that, the responsibility falls upon the military officers and the civilians, not the RPF. Then, what about this criminal approach? Some people might say that these are not the consequence of peasants or whatever, but these are the consequences of the crime policy, the purpose of which was to uproot this type of approach before, during, and after the events of the genocidal events. The Hutu peasants were massacred, but they are scared about the RPF because, in this respect, of course, they were, let's say, fed up by this propaganda, etc. So, if you say the opposite, for example, if you do not take stock of those milestones as a researcher, as a journalist, or as a sponsor, you might, of course, call all this into question. Now, what about the role played by France in Rwanda? This is, of course, another tricky issue. Since 1994, the French policy has been denounced, exposed, because of the tense situation, because of those issues that have been reiterated, and sometimes they become almost true. But that was not the fact. That was not reality. The French policy, there are three periods as far as the French policy is concerned. First of all, between 1990 and 1994, as French people said, France, of course, military operations were conducted by France in order to fight against any aggression, especially because that was, of course, the policy followed by the French operations. And to calm down the situation regarding President Mitterrand, rebels were not who represented a minority of 12% of Rwandans who were supported by English-speaking countries, could not overthrow those presidents, especially regarding the private African backyards. So the French policy was the following. It was, of course, legitimate for France to take action. The French commitment was led to two things. First of all, the military operations. Officers were sent over to protect the expatriates and to provide counsel's advice to the military Rwandan forces. Apparently, this commitment was built up especially because of the offensive conducted by the rebels. French soldiers had the possibility to fight against the rebels. This military commitment was, of course, counterbalanced by specific political and diplomatic measures, especially for the negotiations with the RPF. The political support and military support provided by France to the interim regime would represent the security strand in favor of democracy, to respect human rights, etc. But it sounds that this type of policy has a good policy in order to reach the French diplomatic objectives. Military cooperation would make it possible to stabilize the regime and to fight against the rebels. And political pressures and diplomatic pressures would lead to the power sharing. Having said that, there was a gap between the intentions and the scarce resources of the French diplomacy. And at the end of the day, regarding extremists of the Hutu powers, they believed that France would be on their side, since the French authorities did not react regarding what was performed because of those massacres, killings, etc. And even though they knew what was happening on the field, it was envisageable that extremists would not accept to be on their side. First of all, regarding the various stakeholders, there was a red line, the red line that the RPF should not exceed. And of course, it would have been necessary for the Kigali authorities to know that, of course, there were a limit not to go beyond the limits. And that was so much important for France. Of course, they were not supposed to push the limits, according to the French policy. So, regarding the presence of France in Rwanda, does not mean 100% support to the situation at that time, regardless of what detractors would say. This policy between 1990 and 1994 was a failure, and because of mass graves that were discovered at that time, there was an imbalance between that type of policy, and I would say that fueled this feeling of impunity of the extremist Hutus. In this respect, France is partly responsible for this process that led to genocide. But we have to be careful, because there was a gap between what President Mitterrand said and the outcome. Maybe it was a mistake regarding the assessment, regarding the implementation of the decisions, etc. Instead of any pact, any agreement with the devil, because that was not our purpose. Now, what about the Turquoise operation? 26 years later, this operation, is a tricky issue in France. We might say that regarding the past, what was previously done, of course, France was not supposed to put an end to the genocide. And having said that, we have to say that nobody was interested in conducting a military operation in Rwanda. So it was what was decided, either an imperfect military operation, or they would have given up. So we might say that those who have pure hands don't have any hands anymore, as Charles Péguy would say. So the Turquoise forces were supposed to badly act in Zaire. The genocide, the perpetrators of genocide did not need the Turquoise operation to act, to do what they did. The perpetrators of genocide fled, crossed the border, because of the military strategy conducted by the RPF since the inception of the war. And this is, of course, that was their purpose. That was their purpose at that time. And this type of strategy was went on during spring 1994, and that was the same in Zaire in 1996 and 1997, by the way. Observers said they were a bit skeptical about that regarding the humanitarian profile of the Turquoise operation, the presence of special forces, weapons, and as General Germanos said, this is not a genocide, we don't know who is responsible for what, etc. So that was, of course, very ambiguous, and at the end of the day, people were a bit skeptical about that. France was accused to help their former allies, for example, to put an end to the RPF action, to force RPF to negotiate. This is what was said at that time. Maybe, perhaps, that was the case. But having said that, whenever you prepare an operation, a military operation, first of all, several scenarios have to be envisaged regarding the context, regarding the political measures, etc. And then the politicians will, of course, make this final decision. We might wonder what happened. For example, if President Mitterrand would have been able to do whatever he wanted to do, etc. Not easy to say, but that was not reality. In fact, the President, with Edouard Balladur, opted for a limited intervention. It was not, of course, Kigali should not be besieged or whatever. The final scenario was just to leave, to set aside the Rwandan temporary forces, to evacuate the nationals and to go on with a humanitarian operation. And you might say that, of course, the outcome was not so good. The number of Tutsis was not so high compared to the, if you consider the genocide, etc. But of course, you cannot give a good overall understanding of this situation. I believe that lots of people were rescued, especially because of this huge humanitarian crisis. I would say that France has played a major role, especially regarding this area of safety, security. And it was possible for those people to of course, find an alternative compared vis-à-vis the RPF. There are other shadows regarding the Turquoise operation, some gaps or whatever, some issues that might be raised, the disarmament of the militias, of the armed forces, accusations, for example, regarding the Bicicero affair and the deliveries of weapons, etc., at the same time of the Turquoise operation. Of course, I'm not going to put a judgment upon that. I do not have I cannot put a judgment. Well, these are just indictments, and then it's either we are right or they are wrong. But the role played by the Commission of Historians will have the possibility to put a judgment upon that. Regarding those gaps raised by the Turquoise operation, the major problem for the French diplomacy is that they were, well, of course they did run a humanitarian operation at the last time, but at the end of the day, that was a rescue operation, and I understand that those who were responsible of the French diplomacy are a little bit embittered. For example, for the veterans, for example, who took part in this operation, the main fault for France, it's not the Turquoise operation. This is an operation that was conducted 3 months before. The major crime is about this, the fact that they gave up, that France, that Belgium, the US, for example, did give up an intervention 3 months before the operation. The French state is partly responsible for this process that led to this tragedy, but having said that, at the same time, the French diplomacy should not be considered as the scapegoat for that, because in spring 1994, nobody was able to have a good visibility of the genocide, and I think that we have to be careful in order to identify the right causes, especially regarding the Mille Collines area. The Rwandan population is, of course, responsible for what happened. This is their own history. Genocide is the outcome of a dynamic regarding the Hutu power. That was, of course, the strong part of it. And this is not, of course, I'm not saying that the militias are not guilty for that or responsible for that, but of course, regardless of the crimes committed. And I would say that, of course, since facts have been established, I don't think that facts should, of course, be well analyzed. Not always in favor of the Hutu power or anything else. And I think that the formula, the sentence said by Albert Camus about colonization is the right sentence. France cannot be the only one that is responsible for that, as Albert Camus would say. As a conclusion, I would like to tackle this issue regarding the commission composed of various historians. And 25 years after the genocide, I would say that the commitment of France is not very perfect. And this is a scientific job that has to be carried out, which relies upon a specific scientific approach or judgment. And we need, of course, to be able to interpret, to construe all the documents that are available regarding this specific issue in order to provide a good scientific job. But this job has to be completed, achieved. And I hope that the job performed by the Commission of Historians will make it possible to find out the solutions, especially the level of involvement of the officers, the French officers and soldiers between 1990 and 1994, the French policy in favor of humanitarian rights, what happened exactly to the former president of the Rwanda, etc., and what happened after the assassination of President Habyarimana, because French people would say at that time that the airplane was shot down because of Belgian reasons, etc. And so, for example, the intelligence services also, of course, have all the documents have to be identified regarding the operations, exfiltration of the soldiers who were left in Rwanda after the Amaryllis departure. And of course, that was another issue, but we are not able to clarify the situation. And last but not least, all the accusations for weapons delivery before and during the genocide. So this commission, Leclerc Commission, will access all the documents, and I do hope that we will be able to clarify the situation thanks to the Commission of Historians about these issues. And this is a quote from Henry Kissinger. Authors have been able to use those quotes partly. And as Henry Kissinger said, you can give evidence about anything if you select the documents. Thank you for your attention.